Hello and welcome to today's OneOp webinar. I am Kaylin Goebel and I am a Program Development Specialist here for OneOp. I will be moderating today's session on public health approaches to suicide prevention, working with military service members. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief tour of our webinar platform so you can find your way around, especially if this is your first time joining us. Hopefully, you are currently able to view the slides we're sharing. If you can't see them or are having any other technical difficulties, please email us at contact@oneop.org for tech support. We hope you join us in engaging in the chat pod today, as many of you have already started. To embed the chat pod so you don't miss any links or conversations, simply place your cursor over the shared slides. You should then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of your screen, and from there, just click that chat bubble icon. When typing questions and comments, please make sure that you have everyone selected from the drop-down menu response so that everyone attending can see your contributions to the chat and your comments today. Slides and resources are available for download on the webinar event page, and I will be covering continuing education information at the end of the webinar. So please stay tuned until the very end once the content has been concluded if you're interested in obtaining CE credits or wish to receive a certificate of attendance. And finally, closed captioning is available for this webinar. You can turn on subtitles via the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen as well. Thank you for joining us as we continue our partnership with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to expand the readiness, knowledge, and networks of professionals like yourselves supporting our military service members and their families. For today's session, we are glad to be joined by presenter Dr. Keita Franklin. Dr. Franklin is an accomplished senior executive whose expertise has focused on key wellness areas, including suicide prevention, mental health, and substance abuse. Dr. Franklin has spent her 25-year career driving complex organizational and policy change. She has served as a senior executive in both the Department of Defense and the Department of Veteran Affairs, where she was the principal advisor around suicide prevention. As a national leader in suicide prevention, Dr. Franklin was responsible for leading a multidisciplinary team of experts in the advancement of evidence-based prevention practices for over 3 million active duty members and 20 million veterans and their families. Dr. Franklin currently leads the mental health work within the Deloitte government and public health sector, where she is engaged across federal health accounts. She also serves as the co-director of the Columbia Lighthouse Project and on numerous boards, and is, of course, an advocate for military communities. Before I hand things over, a few quick reminders. If at any point you need to step away from today's session, a recording of this presentation will be available on the webinar event page for on-demand viewing, and that's typically available within 24 to 48 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. And one more reminder that you can download a presentation PDF handout, as well as a list of the resources Dr. Franklin will be mentioning today throughout the session on the webinar event page. And again, I will be covering continuing education credits at the end of today's session, so please stay tuned as we wrap things up for those instructions. And with that, I'm glad to turn things over to Dr. Franklin to begin today's session.
Hi, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be with all of you this afternoon. Anyways, early afternoon, I'm here on the East Coast, and I could not be more pleased when the OneOp folks reached out to me for this opportunity. In part, I started my career in the family advocacy program in July of 2001, right before 9/11. And I have just some fond memories of working in family advocacy over the years. I started out at McChord Air Force Base. And I saw somebody put into the chat that they were of course, it was not the Joint Base at the time, so this goes way back, but I definitely appreciate the work that is done in family advocacy, the work on the front lines from both the prevention side and the treatment side. So this is just like full circle for me. So I really appreciate the chance to be on with everybody. Because this is a CEU, because we're offering CEUs for this, I just want to make sure we're super clear on the learning objectives. And so folks can see those here on the slide, but know that we're going to talk quite a bit about how to screen for suicide risk. So we will talk about the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. I will give you the entire scoop behind the scale, how it was developed and how to use it. And then we're also going to talk about public health approaches for saving lives. You know, it is not the singular responsibility of clinicians when it comes to suicide prevention. And we'll get into more about what public health means in that context. We will also cover, as a reminder, because I know so many of you are clinicians or helping professionals on the field, you likely know quite a bit already about anxiety and depression, but we'll talk a little bit more in depth about the interconnectedness between anxiety, depression, and suicide risk, and sort of how to unpack and sort through some of that. And then I see Julie saying her office is also McCord. I have, like I said, such fond memories of that time. So finally, we will also go into the evidence-based practices, like what are the approaches for engaging with service members, military-connected adults who are struggling. And again, I know many of you have worked in this field for quite some time. So in many cases, this will probably be a refresher for you. At the same time, I do know just from my own work here in Washington, D.C., that I've run into many people in the field that go many years in their profession without interacting with somebody at risk of suicide. So it might not be a skill you use all the time. So it's probably good for all of us just to kind of have a quick check-in. So on the content. So we do have like an early webinar poll. So I'm going to ask folks to answer this question. Only mental health clinicians can and should work to prevent suicide. If folks can go ahead and answer the poll. Yep. And if the poll's not popping up on your screen, put it in. And I did not mean to give this away in my early talk. I see a lot of people have the right answer here. So this is absolutely correct. And I know Kaylin might want to show us the poll results, but it looks like folks are on the money here. Early on in the field, you should know that there was this thinking in the field of suicide that when people were struggling with risk, we needed to scoop them up and get them over to the mental health clinician right away, that there was this magic work that could happen in therapy and, you know, we could solve all their issues. And if only we had more therapists, we could, you know, take care of this. And it looks like all of you well know the fact that it is not the singular responsibility, and mental health clinicians are certainly part of the fight, but they're not the only person in the fight. And we know that when we're doing good suicide prevention work, we know that we are likely engaging with a whole host of other people, whether that's the military chaplain, whether that's the person, you know, at risk. Maybe it's their neighbor that's working with them. Maybe it's their close colleague. Peer support is such a big thing. Maybe it's their battle buddy at the gym. Like when people are healthy and they have these wide social networks that engage and help them, we know that we're tapping into all avenues, not just that 1 hour of therapy a week. So I appreciate that folks already know that. So this is awesome. Let me also kind of keep moving here. In terms of another short answer response, if folks can share your response on why you prioritized attending this webinar. Is this just a topic that folks have a keen interest in? Did you want to engage with your own colleagues? You wanted to learn more? Okay, good. I see some of them rolling out the CSSRS. That's excellent. Just learning more about primary prevention. I see all the answers rolling in as a review. Yes. The field is changing quite a bit constantly, especially with technology and new innovative tools and social media and all things like that. It is important to stay on top of like the latest and greatest. Okay, good. I appreciate you guys are popping them in fast and furious, and I got to catch up on reading them. This is good. Army Stars work. We can certainly talk more about that. This is critical. Okay. All right. Well, awesome. I appreciate you guys keep them rolling in there. Let's look, you know, like any good social scientist, as we begin to deep dive into this content together, I just want to also give you guys a little look at the data. And you see on this slide that the population that you all are working with, in particular, do generally speaking have higher rates of both depression and anxiety. And so that's something for us to think about in terms of your own work in family advocacy. So people that might be coming into the military with pre-existing traumas, people that are and then deployed and or experiencing high operational tempo in the work environment, and then diagnosed at higher rates of both depression and anxiety. And post-COVID, if you look at the literature in general, even outside the military sector, there are higher rates of anxiety. Anxiety is at an all-time high in terms of people struggling with it in the field, trying to figure out how to best help people a post-COVID environment. So understanding the prevalence rates is super important, because when you're trying to apply public health approaches to suicide prevention, it's good to know who's struggling and with what. And so here I have some additional data for you on suicide risk. And I would just, and folks can look at it and we'll go over it a little bit, but I would also ask you to think through what you know at your own local bases and stations in terms of risk. And is there a possibility to dig into your own data? So for example, at the Joint Base Lewis McChord, do you know the rates of depression and that footprint? Do you know how many people in your community are struggling with anxiety? Are you able to pull that data? And in part, it will help you understand how to organize your service delivery because of the connection between depression, anxiety, and suicide. It will help you understand that, for example, if you have, 25% of your, I'm making up the figure here, but just to give an example, 25% of our population struggles with depression and anxiety, and it's mostly those under the age of 24, that helps you think through your service delivery and sort of what to do about it. So public health at its core starts with understanding our data. It starts with like knowing who's at risk and knowing also who's doing well. And how do we, like years back, I led behavioral health for the Marine Corps, and we used to talk about how do we grow the green? Like, how do we help identify who's doing well and get more people in that bucket? And part of knowing how to do that involves being able to crawl all over your data. And if we were taking this a step further, we would even say, like, collectively, what do we know at our individual bases about depression, anxieties, family violence? I know you know those numbers really well, but alcohol as well. And are we looking at all of the data holistically in a way to organize public health approaches, which I'll talk more about what those approaches are. So you can see here that suicide is a problem not only in the military. You can see the total number of adult and children deaths, and the data is always delayed when it's released. And so you guys probably have local data faster than the national level. But while we're on this call today, we'll likely be on the call for 90 minutes. There'll be one death by suicide every 11 minutes. So across the nation. So you can even do the math on that and know that, like, we will lose people today during the time that we're on this call. And it's always a struggle and a little bit tricky when you're talking about suicide data, because you definitely want to know the data and you want to monitor it and surveil it and have a goal and working towards sort of getting it lower and to the point of zero. But at the same time, you should never lose sight of the fact that each and every one of these data points are a person. And I know that all of you as social workers and clinicians on the call know this, but sometimes it can be easy to say, oh, we have 45 or we have 47. Those are actual service members. Those are actual adults in our footprint that have moms and dads and brothers and sisters, just like some of us on this call today, that are impacted. And it's a tragedy across the board. And again, I know I don't have to tell that to this group, but when you're thinking about suicide data, you're not only thinking about those that complete, you're also thinking about those that are having thoughts, right? And so this is an issue around ideation. And I know you've probably heard that term, but it's ideation, and then it's attempts, and then completed suicide. We never in the field say a successful suicide. Like, that's not okay language. But part of why it's important to think about our data in the context of ideations, attempts, and completions is it gives those of us that work in the field a point of intervention. If we know that those that are having ideations on our base are going up, that's some good data point to know. Like, that's good. Like, let's organize some services around there. Let's figure out what to do. And for attempts, when we have a completed suicide and we look back, I spent some time, leading suicide prevention at the DoD and at the VA, and we would do these fatality reviews. And inevitably, you would see when somebody ended their life by suicide that they had an attempt in their history. So if attempt is a key factor, and I'm working at, Fort Meade or something here, not too far from DC. And I know that I have a certain population of people that have made an attempt. I want to get my arms around those people. I want to provide additional services. I want to know what else I can do for them. So understanding attempts as a precursor for potential increased suicide risk is important. And I see somebody in the chat talking also about an increase in ideation along the border. And that is just incredible work going down on down there, and I spent some time down there myself with some unaccompanied children not too long ago. And certainly situations of despair and feeling like you have no way out and you have no knowledge of what your future holds, um, makes people at increased risk. So I can totally see that there in Texas. And also I'm glad that somebody's highlighting in the chat that, it's happening now. There's a death by suicide like it's happening now. We need to know more about what to do about it. And there are people that are attached to these issues. And so I, again, appreciate you highlighting that. So let's look also at our military data. So you should know that the Defense Suicide Prevention Office publishes a report. You can put it into Google and you can pull their quarterly reports. If you want to know what's going on for completed suicides in the whole DoD. And why is that helpful? Well, you might be briefing your leadership and they might say, okay, so I understand that we have, 4 suicides at Fort Jackson, but how do I compare to the whole Army? And so they might want to know that, like, is my share higher than where it should be based on the size of my base? I'm a small base, I'm a medium base, I'm a large base, and I have, for example, 40,000 Marines at Camp Pendleton. So what does that mean for who is at risk? And am I struggling at a rate and pace that's higher than my peers, knowing that one is too many, right? Like we would not accept and we would not stop trying to prevent suicide. So people like to know, like, how do they compare? And I, there's probably all sorts of theories in the zoo about comparing and is that good or bad or not, but we all know how senior leaders think and they often like to do that. But equally so, it's good to know if, how we're tracking as a whole service. Are we going up? Are we going down? And so you see, these are the first quarter suicide data. And we see here that the active component deaths increased by 19 compared to this exact same time last year. So 94 now versus 75. And again, it's very, very concerning when the numbers continue to go up. And people always ask questions about, like, is that statistically significant? Well, it matters, but like, we're not here to, like, I think, go into, whether or not the data going up by this small percentage is significant. It's always significant if it goes up by one person. So you see here the Army deaths increased, and the Army being like the largest service branch, you can imagine they will, you'll see bigger increases there. The Marine Corps being a small service branch, and you see still increases by 6. You see here the Navy stayed the same, the Air Force increased by 1. And you see the Space Force data. So just something for us to think about, and also to be able to track over time with our own local data. Reserves, of course, I know there's some folks that put into the chat that they are working on the reserve side, and you all can probably share some of those nuances better than I, but it's very specific, and that which works for the active forces does not always work for the reserve forces, and they do have unique nuances. And you can see some of the data here, and it's just interesting that it's increasing by 2 across the board. And so you see here, the number of reserve suicide deaths stayed the same when compared to last year. So staying the same is a tricky one, because so it stays steady. And of course, that is not good. It's also better than it going up. We want to see it go down. And I see here someone saying the link is not working. All right, we'll work on that. Thank you, Nikki, for bringing that to our attention. Definitely want you guys to have access to the latest and greatest data as it comes out. And here's a little bit more on the National Guard suicide deaths. In terms of Army and Air Guard, both decrease. Oh, I see Army National Guard decreased by 4 versus Air increased by 4. So just a little bit more about suicide in terms of the context. We know across the board, this is not just within the military sector, that it's the 10th leading cause of death in the nation. And it's the 2nd leading cause of death for younger populations under the age of 24. And then I showed you some of the data that points to the fact that military and veteran communities have higher rates than their like-matched civilian counterparts. And, I get the question a lot. And when I worked in the Pentagon, I would get the question, is it really preventable? Are we just going to lose a certain amount to suicide like we do to battle? Like people would sort of say these things. And all of us in the field, and if you pull up SAMHSA's website, you will see it is absolutely preventable. When the right people know the right things and we're able to intervene at the right time and instill hope and evidence-based practices, it is preventable. And when somebody dies by suicide, it's largely the result of a systems failure. It's never the result of like a single clinician or a single base or a single military leader. It is a systems failure. Somewhere someone fell through the cracks in the context of the system. And so working on behalf of like increasing the capacity of the system to do better on behalf of the clients, just like you do in family advocacy when you're working on systems issues, it does help. Yes, a culture of prevention is super important. I appreciate that comment in the chat too. So I want you to know, like, as you leave the webinar, one of the learning objectives was truly about like gaining an increased understanding of who is at risk. And, you know, this can also be tricky because I would get questions sometimes about like, tell me the top 3 risk factors and the top 3 things you're doing about it. You know, a well-meaning military leader would say, you know, I want to know the top 3. And it's never just like the top 3. I mean, there are a multitude of risk factors, sometimes like up to 20 to 25, and they all interact together. And then what is sort of missing in that equation is like what we say in the field, protective factors, or like buffers, or sometimes you'll see military leaders use the term like mitigators, like what's mitigating that risk. So what happens is when we see on the fatality reports and all that we learn about suicide from the literature, you see individuals who have a history of abuse. So think about what we know about who joins the military, right? We sometimes have people who join that have pre-existing risk factors. Those of you that have done mental health in the military over the years know that when you do that initial assessment and you ask them, like, do you have any history of abuse in your family? It is not uncommon for them to talk about child physical abuse, even extreme child neglect when they grew up. I'm sure some of you that are treating FAP cases, you know, they're coming in and they're like, when I was a kid, I was parented this way. And they have all manner of things that in your mind likely leads you to know that they have a history of abuse, and they're joining the military for all the right reasons, to get themselves on track, to have structure, all the things that you all on this call likely know because you're treating clients and closer to the issues than I am. But if I talked already about them having prior suicide-related behavior, having been involved in mental health treatment, a prior attempt, involved in substance abuse, all of these things interacting together, like think of it like like a bag just being shook up, like all of the balls in the bag, just, you know, being shook up. And then they have the absence of a social network. So a protective factor might be like they have all that going on, but they're close with their mom and dad. They have close friends. They're in touch with, you know, long-standing friends. They have deep relationships, right? The absence of that disrupted social networks. And so one of the things we see, I don't know if any of you are working with military members that are transitioning out, and super high risk time. So if they're transitioning out, even by regular reasons, like my career is done and I'm transitioning out, that first 12 months, even up to the first 5 years after they transition out, is a high risk period for suicide. We see the data going up in that period. But add on top of that, if they were transitioning out for reasons not their own. So you all might be interacting with people that are transitioning out because they have a serious family violence case, and they're getting an other than honorable discharge, and they are losing their peer network. They are no longer the go-to guy in the unit. They're no longer the top cop, the top shirt, they're now being marginalized, and their social network is disrupted. Inevitably, like if someone asked me, what's the top risk factor for suicide? And I had to answer it knowing that it's complex and there's not one, I would say deterioration of relationships, lack of social support. And so couple that also with sleep issues. There is many of you might know Thomas Joyner, famous researcher. I say famous. I don't know if he would want me saying that, but in the field that has studied suicide for a long, long time. And he tells his story of suicide risk in his own family. Thomas shared one time that in the absence of screening for suicide risk, you could screen for sleep and it would be a proxy for suicide risk. And I thought that was so interesting because I've also had the opportunity to interview many spouses who've lost a service member to suicide, and they will say he or she was not sleeping in the days leading up to their death. So I know that you're doing comprehensive assessments when you're meeting with your clients as part of your family advocacy work. But I just offer to you just are you asking about sleep, and are you thinking about sleep in an ongoing basis? And I see Dawn's asking me the name. Look up Thomas Joyner. It's Joiner, and look up his work. He does some incredible work in the field. So sleep issues, definitely. And I think many of the others on this list are self-explanatory, but I also want to talk to you for a minute about firearms. We have, of course, this is not a Second Amendment issue, and she who is a social worker is not a firearms expert, but bear with me. In the civilian outside the military data, we see that individuals who end their life by suicide use a firearm 50% of the time. And other times they use other means, pills, bridges, awful other means, but know that it's 50% firearms. With our military population, it's 70% firearms. And again, Thomas has a theory on this, and it's like his theory of interpersonal violence. And it really speaks to the fact that when individuals have access to lethal means, meaning they have one home around them, and that's not a bad thing. That's their choice. And all of our military members, of course, they're often fond of their firearms, and they have a decreased focus on pain. Like, they have a high tolerance for pain, and less tolerance of fear. When all of that comes together, it can be deadly. And so what we try to do in the field is, maybe some of you have heard this term, put time and space between the person at risk and the identified means, meaning the firearm or the pills or whatever. In our case, it's largely firearms because that's the highest, what the data tells us. So we try to get them to lock them up. And there is this point of suicidal thinking that happens when somebody is at risk, and they, in their mind, think that they are a burden and that the world would be better without them. And when they have instant and easy access to a firearm, it's just quick and deadly. And that's why the data tells us that, men complete suicide more and women attempt more. Women use less lethal means. They use pills, and we can get in and save them. And a split second is all it takes. And so we've seen this on the national stage with Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain. You've seen people that have ended their life by suicide, and they're in that throes of suicidal thinking. And there is a piece of suicide that is, you see it on the slide, impulsive. So when we've interviewed people that have made an attempt and lived, they say the minute they made the attempt, they had a thought that the only thing that was not solvable, that they were struggling with, was the very fact that they made that attempt. So if you haven't looked at Kevin Hines is also just another treasure in the field, but he tells this story of struggling with mental health and with wanting to end his life by suicide. Yes, the movie, The Ripple Effect. One of the things he says in his talk and in his movie is that, I wanted the pain to go away, and I did not want to die. And he makes this jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, and he says the minute he touched the handles of the bridge, the bar, and he said the minute he said, what did I just do? And that's a story that's a theme that we hear often from those that have made attempts. So when we can get in the way of that suicidal thinking, we know that we can break that idea of making an attempt. We know that we can, if they have to unlock a lock for the lockbox, if they have to go to their friends, that is just a split second enough time to sometimes save a life. I see in the chat that somebody's asking, is that 70% across all identities, or are there gender differences? And yes, there are. So women will attempt with less lethal means. And I'll have to pull that data point out in terms of, because I don't want to get it wrong with you, but women use pills and other methods where people are able to get in and save them. And men are more likely to use a firearm. And within the thing that's changing on that right now, the hottest sort of piece of research on that is women veterans. I know most of you all are working with active duty, but know that women veterans are using firearms more than their women counterparts. In part, we believe it's because they have them. And we believe that they also have some of the other characteristics where they have less fear of them, and they have high tolerance for pain based on their military work. And know that I know the OneOp folks are going to send these slides out to folks. I always tell people when I give talks, what's mine is yours. So anything you can do to hopefully the OneOp folks are okay with this because we did create these together. I always love to share the content and give the slides to people so they can make them their own and you can use them locally at your base. And like anything I have that I can give to providers, to practitioners to help use or save lives in the field locally, I always do. So somebody is also asking about active duty and reserve component counterparts. So yes, this notion of female veterans increasingly using firearms applies to the veteran side, not so much the active duty and reserve. But it is interesting to see that that rate of women veterans attempting and completing suicide going up compared to other times. So what's the difference between cognitive factors between vet women and civilian women? Cognitive factors. I will have to get back to you on that one. I'm not sure. Are they thinking differently about things? That's a good question. All right, well, we will take that one for action. Let me keep kind of going through some of these. I want to make sure, oh, there was one more that I want to hit on, and that is rejection and abandonment. And that has a lot to do with getting out of the military, no longer feeling like you fit in, lack of a sense of belongingness. When you're early in the military and you know your role and you know that if I show up in this unit and I do this thing every day, this plane flies and we win wars and we do great things. You feel like you belong, you know the mission, you know your purpose, and you have a sense of unit cohesion and a group to do it with. And that is big protective factors. When all of that goes away and there's a sense of rejection and abandonment and you've been marginalized, then that's when the risk for suicide goes up. And then we see like increased hopelessness and helplessness, which is our big factors for suicide risk. So here is I have a couple of myths and facts dispersed throughout this slide deck today. So there's a misconception that says if you own a firearm, it's not associated with increased suicide risk. And in fact, we see that is not true. When you own one and when the going gets rough, what we see is this trifecta where you own one, you're struggling with depression or anxiety or some sort of mental health, and you're drinking alcohol, this kind of trifecta, and you have a firearm that is being kept loaded and unlocked, it increases your risk for dying by suicide by 4 to 6. It actually increases your risk even without the mental health and the alcohol. But I just share with you a lot of the cases that I read about have a lot to do with alcohol and mental health issues all at the same time. I see that the doctor here is clarifying the question. So earlier when we were talking about the rate of women veteran suicides using firearms and that was increasing, we have a question here that says, is that active and reserve component counterparts? No, so this is the veteran data. So I'm sharing with you a little bit about the veteran side. In part, sometimes when we pick up insights from the veteran side, we can use it to then inform prevention on the active duty side, if that makes sense. Hopefully using the data from the veteran side to inform our prevention and work upstream on the active duty side to try to get ahead of some of that. Here's another big myth for the field. And you guys let me know in the chat if you've seen this locally as well. People have this sense of being afraid to talk about suicide because they are concerned it will encourage people to end their life by suicide. And so there's been all of this data that says when you were struggling with suicide risk and somebody asked you the question, whether that was your provider or your friend or your spouse, did that give you the idea? Does using the S word, and in fact, it's not true. What we see is when you talk about it, it helps to reduce the stigma, and then people end up being more inclined to think you are there for them and that you're there to support them, and they do not suddenly have a random idea. You know what? Now that you said that, I think I am. No, that's not the case. I say this to tell you, don't hesitate to bring it up. I want to also, yes, it does increase safety. I see somebody wrote in the chat that it helps people feel safe, and I should have said that. And I appreciate folks adding other pieces to this complex puzzle into the chat. I want to explain to you, many of you probably heard this term postvention, right? Sometimes we make up I think fancy terms for our field that when we don't need to, but this is a longstanding term that means caring for those that have been affected by suicide. When I first became a new social worker in 1994, there was a figure out there that said whenever one person ends their life by suicide, 7 people are impacted. Mom, dad, brother, sister, kids, there was 7 people. fast forward all of these years, we now say 135 people are impacted by suicide when one person dies. And we also will, you'll hear the word in the literature, exposed. So think about cigarette smoke when you're exposed to that, or like when you're exposed to some chemical or something, right? It goes through your body. The reason this is important is because it means you are now at risk. So if you're at Fort Jackson and you have 4 suicides in the last month, we could multiply 4 times 135. Those are the number of people, and I'm doing a silly elementary example, but those are the number of people that are now at risk on that base because they know the person, particularly with the military, they over-identify with the person. They're thinking like, okay, well, there's Sergeant so-and-so. He had a divorce. He had an Article 15. He's in the weight management program. They've like moved him to the, different duties. And I have that same set of problems, and they begin to identify with them and think, maybe suicide is a way out for me too. So when people are exposed, we also see this in when you do like genograms. Does anybody like genograms? And you've done these over the years with your families in clinical settings. It's not uncommon to see people say like, my grandfather died by suicide. My father's made 3 attempts and I'm having thoughts. It will travel down like gender lines, and they'll tell you this as part of an assessment. So we have 135 people die by suicide every day in the US. So if we had a quick calculator, we would see how many people were then at risk. And I argue that the risk is compounded on military bases because units are really like a family. Like a military unit can sometimes sort of be like this level of cohesion where they're so tight that when one does end their life by suicide, it how do I want to say this? It can kind of shut down the shop. And we've got to tend to them with like a post-vention strategy. So again, I know that the DoD has some checklists for commanders and some tools on the DISPO website around post-vention, but I challenge folks to just even put that term into Google and learn more about it so that you can think through how to help others who are impacted, whether that's a family advocacy client or someone else on your base. It's important work. So I want to talk more about public health. All of us in the field, of course, know clinical side so well, right? Like the clinical side of helping people, this idea of like people coming into our offices or home visits and us providing evidence-based practices, and that's all very clear. Public health is sometimes a little bit more squishy, and it's hard to sometimes understand exactly what it is because it's so many things. So when you're doing public health, I talked earlier about the fact that you're covering down on the data. As a clinician in your community, how many child abuse cases you have at your base, how many domestic violence, how many people are at risk of suicide. In fact, you probably know how many people are on your domestic violence rolls and have made an attempt by suicide, the intersection of both of those. So you do your good data. But if we were then taking that and sort of expanding it into the rest of public health, you would also be doing good screening for suicide, which we're going to talk about more on this talk today. Equally so, you would have a campaign. Maybe the campaign years back was like, be there for one another. Maybe the campaign is, I'll give you a long legacy one from family advocacy. Forever ago, there was a campaign which was grab the phone, not the baby. And it was really like a shaken baby prevention campaign. And, that was like a slogan that they would say, like, this is your brain on drugs, was like back in the day. So you would have a campaign, and the campaign would hopefully increase awareness that it's okay if you're not okay and that you should get help. So you would, going back down our list, you would know your data and you would organize your services accordingly. There would be some campaign for psychoed. You would offer training at your base on stress management, anger management. I know many of you are doing that, but you would also try to build up relationships and keep people healthy. So there would be, various training opportunities. You would bolster peer support, like moms meeting with moms, dads with dads, parenting support groups, all of those things that I know you do. You would also continue your evidence-based practices in clinical settings. You would have partnerships, like you would be on coalitions and you would be joining outside the gates partnerships, inside the gates coalitions, all of that good stuff. And then you would be evaluating all that you're doing. You would have some evaluation measure in place that we're looking at all these factors and sort of thinking through, of all these levers that I just went over, what's working and what's not. But all of this to say yes, and somebody said in the chat, MWR, yes, MWR is key. fun, friendship, healthy living activities, physical fitness, all of that is also key. And I appreciate that comment, but you would have like 10 or 12 things going all at once. But one of them would be clinical, which is super important and probably like very, the most sort of scientific, but know that just like in our field of child abuse and domestic violence, there's a line of literature and people that study this. Equally so is there one in public health, and suicide is 100% a public health problem that brings to bear a bundled set of practices, not a single one, and all of these sort of working together at once. Somebody also in the chat is asking about, is there a known attempt? If there is a known attempt, I'm sorry, does that increase or decrease the risk for peers? And that is a very good question. We know when there's a completion that it increases the risk for peers. I would need to check on what the current research says on whether or not there is an attempt. It stands to reason that when people are surrounded by people that are making attempts and they know about it, that might also go in the same line as completions. But let me check so I can pull the latest data on that and make sure that I'm current before I give you a full answer on that. And I appreciate the question. You guys are getting me thinking here on all this content. So I want to make sure you know what a public health approach is. So like leaving this today, I want you to know that it's a bundled set of practices and it's pushing them at full speed ahead and evaluating them and never stopping. Like you can't pull the needle off understanding your data. You can't decide not to do a campaign. It's all of them interacting together. And equally so, somebody in the chat is reminding us about the importance of policy. That is part of public health. Having a policy on all of these things, a policy on who does what, a policy on the training, a policy on the fact that we're going to ascribe to this set of evidence-based practices, and the power of policy is just incredible. So that is absolutely part. I talked earlier about these pathways of risk and protective factors, and this is like one of the learning objectives that we committed to on this talk today. I have this other sort of way to depict it as well in terms of the risks. And I want to hit on a couple of these that we didn't talk about on the last slide. And that is one being employment. We talk a lot in the field and about like people need jobs. And I know that you all are working with service members that have jobs, obviously, and jobs can be a source of stress. I just want to remind you, like when someone has a job, they usually also have health care. And when they have health care, that increases access to mental health care, which is like absolutely beautiful, right? But then they also usually have a mission and a purpose, just like all of us on the call today. And I can even tell from some of the chats, like we're super passionate about the field, and March is social work month. So happy social work month to all the social workers on here. But we love all the other helping professions as well. But the idea that you feel a sense of mission and purpose and being proud to be, as part of your employment. Also, so you have, in many cases, fun and friendship. I don't know how many of you on the call today have like friends at work, or you have like certain times of like, gosh, a little bit of a stress relief and some fun and friendship. So a job is definitely a paycheck, but there's all these spillover effects that are also protective factors that sort of add to it. And so I just tell you this in the context of those that lose their job, or their job is at risk, and they begin to come in and see you because, they're in trouble for domestic violence and they're concerned about their job being at risk. Certainly they're concerned about not having money, right? They're concerned about how am I going to support my family? Know that it's deeper than that. And so when we can build up protective factors, when people come in to see us in FAP, or in the various areas that you guys work, and we can mitigate the risks, we know we're doing good work. We know that if people are struggling and tell us they have these on again, off again relationships, I bring that up as an example because of your all work in FAP. That in and of itself is a very high risk factor. So when they're having deterioration of relationships, if we can think through what other relations they have that are going good, maybe it's a friend or a parent, so that they continue to have that support during these stressful times, it's like critically important. So there are two different ways to think about how we can reduce risk at our individual bases. And like out of the gate, I tell you, like, think about making sure your clients are connected. Like they're not isolated, they're not lonely. Like connectedness, big capital C, is a big part of it. But you can read some of the others, certainly bolstering economic supports. So when you have people that are like getting fined or their finances are changing in some way, shape, or form, know that that can be a risk. Like they moved to a new base and the wife used to work and now it doesn't work. And all of those things can be complicated. but then also when we make it harder for them to attempt. So when we, we decrease barriers to care, and the military is doing an incredible job, whether it's with the OneSource or MFLAC or new parent support, all of those things that like decrease barriers, like we're willing to see you when and where you want, that is helpful. And when we don't glorify suicides, I would see in the day people like want to do something to memorialize somebody, which we definitely want that to happen, but it's not like the time for like a motorcycle rally, or it's not like, the time for, some sort of like over glorification of it. So all of these become like ways to stop people's pain and make it harder for them to attempt suicide. There are two other important factors that also I'm reminded about by looking on the chat, and that is legal trouble. So when you have a service member that is involved in the legal system, and I only say this because I'm suspecting like many of the FAP cases, right? Like there is a legal element of this at times. And legal trouble is a high risk for suicide, especially in the context of things that are very taboo, right? Child sexual, even domestic violence. These are topics that people are shameful about, and when they're involved in the legal system, that is a high risk. We had an effort underway years back to train all of the attorneys on our bases on suicide risk, and equally so making sure all the attorneys are full on up to speed about the risks associated with domestic violence and child abuse. I would offer you can't go wrong, but it's legal risk. And then there are new reports that have come out about financial stress. So I appreciate that coming up in the chat, just this idea that when people are struggling financially, it is a risk factor for suicide, particularly when they think there's no way out. Bills are mounting, mortgages, being in trouble with command, then that hits over to legal trouble. And you start to see this snowball where that then hits to relationship. And then they're worried they're going to lose their job. And then the financial struggles are going to get worse. And it's just this big snowball where it becomes difficult. If we don't know, we can't insert a protective factor. Not that it's that easy, like, here, let me give you a protective factor. It's not, but at least work with them on gaining insight and building up some protective factors. I talked about part of a broad public health approach involving a campaign in this, and I saw somebody wrote in the chat too, just about the importance of stigma reduction and talking about suicide and how that fights the stigma. And that is also such a good point, because military has come a long way. I'm sure many of you would agree on reducing stigma. Like, it's gotten better, but it's still there. It is still there. My father is a Navy veteran. We were an Air Force family ourselves, traveling around as with young children and the likes in the day. And I recall all of the stigma associated with, like, don't get help, you'll lose your job, your security clearance, your firearm, you're broken, everybody in the unit will know. And there's been some status of forces surveys in the military that actually ask the top reasons for not seeking help. And you see them listed here. But it is also our job to debunk some of that too, right? So like in the day, I've also seen surveys or not surveys, but data analysis where you'll look like at, for example, McCord Air Force Base, and like, of those that came in for care this year, how many actually had their career impacted? And pull the data on that in an anonymous way. And it would be good to know, at this base, we treated, I'm making this up, 2,200 people last year. And of those, none of them had their career negatively impacted. And debunk those myths on, like, get in early and get help before it's a problem. And then, it potentially could impact your career. But equally so, I don't think the service members want people on the front lines who are having like extreme mental health issues, carrying weapons and doing these dangerous jobs as well. But stigma is real. There's also a science behind it. Campaigns help. Peer support helps when senior leaders on your base are willing to tell their story when they've gotten help. So powerful. I'm sure many of you have seen that, when a general officer is able to get up there and say, I remember one who shared, I brought my child in for treatment for ADHD. And as part of his treatment, I realized I needed treatment too. And they'll like start to tell about the help they got. And it just, you can see the eyes in the room change of, well, maybe I could do that too. And this person does it, and they are still there in their job every day, and they're doing okay. That means a lot for me too. And they'll begin to think about getting help too. So I talked in the learning objectives about the fact that we were going to cover down on depression and anxiety from like a refresher stand of view here. And I know that many of you on the call are clinicians and you're probably treating depression every day. So as a reminder, there is a connection. The biggest mental health risk for suicide is depression. So screening for depression and making sure making sure clinicians and everyone on your team understands that somebody that is struggling with these issues listed on this slide, helplessness, hopelessness, no longer interested in activities that they were, like going to the soccer field or playing basketball, or, a loss of a parent, feeling very lonely and using alcohol, any of those things that fall in that bucket. Is it, like, to me, an immediate, like if I were cranking up the risk dial for suicide, and I would right away be thinking, okay, I see that this person is struggling with suicide. I've got to ask with depression. I've got to ask them, are they thinking of ending their life? Do they feel like they want to go to sleep and not wake up, just because of the close association for the two? And similarly, I told you we're seeing a rise of anxiety. So helping clients understand what they're dealing with when it comes to anxiety. I will tell you, I have a new nurse in the family, my daughter. She's a new nurse. We're so proud of her. And she reminds me and shares with me that people continue to show up in the ER for chest pain that is anxiety related. And they will tell the medical doctors like they are having a heart attack and they need their chest looked up. And inevitably, it ends up turning into a psych consult for anxiety. And, as a new young nurse, she is amazed on the power of the physical connection. And of course, these are longstanding things we know, but just think about the burden on the larger system when people are showing up at the wrong place for care, like showing up at the ER for anxiety, vice like actually able to get help from other entities. I see somebody's put into the chat, a major symptom often not included in depression, anxiety is prolonged exhaustion. Interesting. I mean, I think that ties a little bit to our little conversation about sleep, but also you're reminding me about just burnout and high operational tempo, and being in a steady state of prolonged exhaustion. And I haven't seen it used in those words. So that is super interesting to think about, and it does make a lot of sense to me. So as a reminder, the intersection of depression, anxiety, they touch suicide. And when someone is in the state of suicidal thinking, they're often in like this black and white thinking where they're a burden on society, they're a burden on their family, people would do better off without them. And they want the pain of anxiety and depression to go away. So when you couple all of that together, you start to see why people wrongly think that suicide is an answer and why we need to get in there and offer the help. So by way of in the chat, if folks have used the CSSRS or are familiar with screening with this tool, like let me know so I can kind of get a feel for like, do people know it? Do people not? I want to go over, okay, more people know it. This gives me a good idea for like what level of depth to go into on it. And please, you guys that use it and know it, chime in on the chat to add to the dialogue if you don't mind. So this is a protocol for screening for suicide risk. And you see here the 6 questions. For those of you that haven't used it, don't be scared. There's not 6 questions all the time. If people answer yes to question 2, then you go on and you ask 3, 4, 5, and 6. So part of the research behind this is that this is a validated scale for those scientists on the call that like to do like validate scales and all things, is that it's a standard method for assessing suicide risk in such a way that the questions were designed that when you ask it, there's a high degree of validity. We know that when we ask this set, we're going to get the right answers. And they've done all of the science to sort of bring that to fruition. And just starting out of the gate, you're asking somebody, have you wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? You're wanting to know if they're having ideation. And then there's a second question associated with that, because sometimes people will say no to the first and or no to the second, but yes to the first. So it's like a 2 question around, have you actually had thoughts? And then the scale moves into like whether or not they're thinking about acting on it. So have you collected the pills? Are you going to use your, do you have a firearm? Oh, you're going to use your brother's firearm? Oh, okay. Where does your brother live? Is it in a lock? Like you're starting to get all these questions in your mind that you want to follow up with based on the results of this. Have you had any intent on acting, right? Like we talked earlier about how an attempt is a precursor. So making sure whether or not they have prior behavior, do they have an intent on acting? Have you started working out the plan? Like, yes, I am collecting these pills, or yes, I know where this gun is and I know that it's unlocked and I know that I can go there on Tuesdays. Like that level of like follow on. I'm not saying insert all of that in the context, all of those following questions in the context of the screener, but these are the things that people will tell you. Have you ever done anything or started to do anything to prepare to do anything to end your life? In the day, I know many of you know we used to have this thing in suicide where we would say, oh, people give away their things. And I don't know that I always see that anymore. Like you would hear like people saying, oh, they give away their CD collection. And I don't know that is as common as it used to be in terms of preparatory behavior. But, we'll see people that write letters. We'll see people that sort of tie up loose ends, if you will. They'll prepare by saying their final goodbyes sometimes. We should also talk on this call about social media. Sometimes they'll put messages on social media like, I just want it all to end. And so then you're going to ask them, how many times in your life did this happen? And you're wondering about the recency factor. Was this within the past 3 months? And so when these questions are asked, we know that it's the collection of all of it, depending on the first two, like I said, that give us the idea, that give us the a clear-cut level of risk. And this is also tricky because risk is fluid, right? It's not like somebody might answer these in the morning and you'll think they're not at risk. And then that night you'll see that a report comes in that they ended their life by suicide. And we do our best work to assess for risk. And I argue that like we need to teach everybody how to assess for risk. Like the front desk worker at the gym could use training on risk assessment. The daycare worker, who sees dad when dad picks up the kids could use training on risk assessment. It's not a screener that only is used in medical settings or community clinics or whatever. But just know, like I was leading suicide prevention for the VA and I would have clinicians that worked in my program that would assess for risk in the morning and we would have a death by suicide in the parking lot of the VA that night. And when we would do the discovery and pull it, you would clearly see that the risk screening was done. And that's why I say like it's a systems failure. It is not the failure of any single clinician. And in the day, the military also had this thought like, well, did that unit get trained? Like training a unit is not singularly going to save a life. Will it help people understand the risks? Yes. But you still have to have all those things we talked about, right? The data and surveillance, the campaign, the peer support, the evidence-based practices, the partnerships, the evaluation. You have to have all of those. So that is what's so hard about this field and why I commend so many of you that are willing to like not only be on this call today, but like learn more about suicide and take on this as our collective mission to save lives, because it's not easy. It is like 100% a difficult, complex problem. And we don't always have all the answers, even those of us that work in the field forever. And that's why like also just even getting to dialogue with you all on the chat is like helpful, because we're in it together and we have to handle complex problems with all the tools that we can. And I see someone's in the chat, like, it's just like CPR, everyone can do it. And it is like, it should be a natural screening. I have colleagues in the field that give these trainings and they will say, it's like seatbelts. Everyone puts on a seatbelt. Everyone should get a screening when or they will compare it to other national campaigns like smoking, where we finally got people to decrease like smoking. Like, okay, so like we've got to educate people. We've got to do more to like get more lives saved. And there's absolutely an app. If you go on the app, you can see more about this tool. The tool was designed by my very good friend and colleague, Dr. Kelly Posner, who's just an incredible treasure for the field. And if you don't know Kelly, put her name into Google as well. And she's always willing to come out and visit with local bases. This is her life's work is tied to teaching people how to screen for suicide risk. And she's very generous with her time and always wants to be a resource for the military, because it's her way, I think, of also paying it forward for the troops and stuff like that. And she comes out of Columbia University, if you haven't seen her work. So then what do you do, right? So like you do this screening, you see somebody's at low risk or moderate risk or high risk, right in front of you, like, what's your mission? And obviously, if someone's at high risk, I know all of you on the call in terms of clinicians know, like, you care for the person in front of you, you keep them safe, you are non-judgmental, and you leave a good impression for future help seeking. And I mean, and that is why I have always said over the years, it is okay if you are not okay. There is times when I'm not okay. You know, it is 100% okay. Um, all of you, I'm sure, know about 988, changed from the long 1-800-873-TALK to now 988, 3-digit number. And because this is such hard work, you definitely need to debrief with each other. I mean, having a client at risk of suicide it can be traumatic for us. And I remember doing this in the field where chaplains will sometimes get clients where, you know, they've sometimes only had one class in mental health themselves. And so they sometimes it's not easy for them. And they'll come later and talk about, like, I had a client who shared they were at risk of suicide and I hope I said the right thing. And like, you just need to talk through it and take care of yourself as well, because, you know, we don't want to burn out anybody in this field, and we want to keep our employees safe and well too. So let's look at a case study together really quick, you guys. So we have this 24-year-old airman. He's having problems at work, newly assigned to his unit, feels like he doesn't fit in, something all of us might be able to resonate with over the years, especially when we were younger. Supervisor passes by him in the office, doesn't say hello, doesn't encourage him at all. He thinks that his prior commander may have told the new commander about his work issues. Maybe it was a FAP case, who knows, or at his last assignment. This frustrates him as he wanted a clean slate, like he was looking for that geographic clean slate, fresh start. He doesn't want to talk to his wife about this. He's concerned if she finds out that he is struggling, she will immediately blame him. He's been drinking as a way to cope, and he realizes it's gotten out of hand. So one day at his way home from work, he then gets a DUI, and he has to tell his wife because she has because she has to come with his supervisor to pick him up from jail. And she's now very angry. So the next day she takes his children and she moves across the country to live with his parents. So I see somebody put something in the chat, and I will address that, but I'm curious about this case study. Oh my, what did I do here? Sorry. Okay, there we go. I'm curious about this case study. What do people think, if you can put into the chat, and I won't forget you, Matthew. What do people think are some of the risks? We can put those into the chat, and I can go back to the case study too, so people can look at it. Oh, so we have this. Oh, and there's a second slide on it that I missed, and I'm sorry because I hit through the slides too quickly. So now he feels like he's off on a bad note. Okay, good. I appreciate that you guys are putting stuff in. He feels alone. He had to get a lawyer. He had to start substance abuse treatment. How familiar does this sound, you guys? He feels like everyone in his group is a lot worse than him, as his drinking is not that bad. He's not in touch with his parents. They weren't happy with his decision to join the military. They don't get along with his wife, so therefore he hasn't spoken to them. And his coworker realizes that he's emotionally struggling and asks him if he's okay. And he feels like his only way out is to end his life. He thinks people will be better off without him. He feels a burden at work. So let me look here. Disconnected in more than one area. Alcohol. Yes. Lots of risks. Lack of family support is so huge. Yes. So what do we see any protective factors? Yeah, he does still have a job. You're right. Somebody put employed. Yes. More risk coming in. Yes. Likely he has command support. We want to believe that, right? Because that is what commanders do, right? We want to believe that more times than not, it is true. He does have access to legal services. A lot of people don't. You're right. He has access to support systems. He has access to you, likely, for where you work. He has people at work that care about him. Yes, we had in some cases to dig a little deep, but I see you guys get it. Like you're able to pull some of the protective factors. The key is we want him to realize he has those, but yes, absolutely. And so now what do we want to say? Like, what do we want to say? And if people have ideas on that, I mean, you want to validate what's going on. You definitely don't want to be judgmental, and you don't want to say, you're not thinking of ending it, are you? Like you want to listen. Absolutely. I appreciate that comment in the chat. You want to build communication where your voice is warm and welcoming, and you're here for them. You want to reflect back and build rapport, staying in the moment. You don't want to scare them for telling you all this, right? I see someone in the chat, you want to acknowledge that you hear their concerns. I hear what you're going through, and I'm here for you, and we will figure this out together. This is a safe place to unpack it, to talk more about it. Yes, you guys are on the money here. So there are ways to effectively communicate about this, and I just offer that you just do it carefully and bring all of your clinical skills to bear so that you are doing it in a way that that reinforces the client rapport and helps them know that you're there for them. There's nothing more important than interacting with somebody at risk and you handling it well and doing it in a way that they know they can trust you and that you will help keep them safe and get them the help they need. But if somebody is at imminent risk, and I appreciate more comments coming in, like, don't judge them. It should be, yes, it should be on there a couple of times. You're right, Don. If someone is at imminent risk, high risk of suicide, based on the screener and all the things that we've talked about, we want to make sure that we are using 988 and that we're staying with them. You're talking to them about, quote unquote, a term we use in the field, and you probably heard it, reasons for living. Being a parent is a reason to live. And although I will tell you that I read fatality reports of parents that end their life by suicide, but being there for your children, you will hear people say, I'm thinking of suicide, and they'll sort of, I don't want to reduce it, but I'm also looking at the clock, but they'll have this whole thing around suicide risk. And they'll say, but I have to feed the cat in the morning. Okay, that's one of their reasons for living. So you are trying to probe around their reason for living through their eyes. You know, in the field, how we always talk about trauma being in the eyes of the beholder, and that people experience trauma differently. Equally so with suicide risk. I mean, if it is through their lens, do they believe they have support? You and I might be like, yeah, you haven't been in touch with your parents, but call them up. You're at risk of, surely they'll talk to you. It's through their lens as to whether or not they have these protective factors. Definitely we want to make warm handoffs, or we could say hot handoffs. Um, Somebody in the chat is also writing about applied suicide intervention skills training. ASSIST is another great evidence-based practice. And if the person is not at imminent risk, it's still a good reason to stay with them and talk to them and ask about their social support. You know, who could they talk to, kind of unpack it more with them, ask them what they're connected with. I want to go back really quick to Matthew's question, because I recognize that so many people chimed in, because I was like, please chime in, but I don't want to miss that one, which was, hold on, I'm pulling it up. 1 second, bear with me. Here it is. Matthew, we're talking here about people going to the ER that may not be the right place. During one of my deployments, I had a family member make an attempt. So I asked them to call a friend and take her there. It ended up making her mental health worse from the embarrassment and fear of medical workers. If I could have had them call 988 and talk to a behavioral health specialist and avoid that experience, it may not have held back her recovery. This is such a good point. So there is actual research that says, this is so crazy to me, because we encourage people to go to the ER all the time. Being in the ER increases risk for suicide. Leaving the ER, when people leave the ER, they are at increased risk of suicide. Waiting in the ER amps people up and increases their risk for suicide. But yet this is like a known thing in the field. Oh, you're at risk of suicide. You need to go to the ER. That's your only entry into psychiatric care. Go to the ER, go to the ER. So this is why you're seeing a lot of states now with these like mobile crisis teams. You're seeing a lot of states with 24/7 peer support lines, because we've now realized that cold environment of the ER. And also, I will tell you, like, not all ER docs are trained for psych issues and mental health struggles, right? They are ready to deal with your broken leg from your car accident more so than they are to deal with your PTSD from your trauma and the fact that you thought you saw an IED in the road that wasn't there, and now you're like struggling and you want to end your life. So you're right. And I appreciate you for bringing that up, because it's not a one-stop ER situation. It is a lot more complicated than that. And also somebody on the chat is saying like 988 may recommend. They have a set protocol at 988, and there are times that they may say go to the ER. I say if ER is the answer, they shouldn't go alone. Someone should stay with them, and someone should recognize if they're getting amped up, and if you end up having to sort of step out, step aside, ask if you can wait in the car, try to get fast tracked once you get there, because it is tricky. Like, this field is not easy. So let's go through also, and I'll look back at some of these other chats. Let's go through some of the things that work, like the evidence-based approaches that work as clinicians in the field and helping organizations that work on behalf of suicide prevention. Like, it is important that you know the other part of the story too, on like what to do about it. Hopefully many of you have heard of that famous caring text study in our field where, I'm sorry, caring letter study. It's now advanced to caring text, but just caring outreach to clients helps. Know that that is an evidence-based practice. Making phone calls and or texts and like, hi, how are you? Messages of hope, all of that works. Making sure people feel like they belong and that they're engaged in physical activity and putting them on like a predictable routine, which I think is also part of CBT when people have activity planning and they get into therapy and they're able to learn things about breathing and mindfulness, and they're able to test their stinking thinking and doing some reality testing and get volunteering, like being associated with something bigger than yourself. And certainly they're associated with the military, but it might mean that they have to start coaching soccer, or it might mean that they need to get downtown and work in the homeless shelter one day a week, or a few hours here and there. Super powerful knowing that you're part of something bigger than yourself. And equally so, like, I know it's no surprise to anybody, but just like the great outdoors, like being a part of in nature and all that does to help calm the senses are also very, very helpful. In terms, I was going to do a role play, but I feel like we did that in the context of this airman, that we spoke about. So I'm going to go ahead and keep going. In terms of the major contributing factors to military suicide, what do you think we need to think about more or address? And I have a list here, and maybe you guys want to double tap on any of those, or you have others. We talked about belongingness, purpose, relationship, financial, legal. I don't know if we hit enough on rural. Rural America, just all that goes with like living in areas where resource allocation is difficult. Access to care is usually not a problem in the military sector because we have it, but still it can be sometimes. And this idea that I need to solve problems myself, rugged individualism is like some that I have listed here. Oh, yes. And people are chiming in and I appreciate that, like constant transition. When am I moving? I recently did have the opportunity to go to Alaska. So I appreciate Michelle saying like just living in Alaska and the isolation during the winter is a huge risk. I bet that might apply to some of the other bases that are just maybe less than desirable. People that go to Alaska, some of them love it and it's their thing, and some of them struggle with it. How ER responds to victims. This is a good point, because thinking about this in the context of your family advocacy work, if the ER is also part of the problem in terms of shame and ridicule or not having appropriate responses to victims, I can see that having an interconnection with some of our conversations about suicide. I have here in the chat that someone's talking about their personal experience with 988 and local ER services that most likely still go to the ER. They identify a plan and intent, and that the mobile crisis teams are hard because they travel with police. I'm so glad that you wrote that, because also making sure that law enforcement are appropriately trained and don't make the problem more difficult is important. So part of that coalition building of public health approaches means getting law enforcement in our side, making sure they understand mental health and suicide and all of those things, so that they're not, oh, pull yourself up from your bootstraps. You know, you could do better. You're a first sergeant. Come on, I expect more. Like, make sure they don't add to it. So here, one of the evidence-based approaches is definitely to screen. And the more people you teach to screen on your base, the more people will identify risk, the more we will save lives. When you don't know, you can't often do what you need to do. So teaching people the screening tool is critically important. So we have a post-webinar check-in. I want to ask you guys, are you comfortable asking someone that you're concerned about if they're thinking of suicide? Like, how comfortable are you doing it? Can you just rattle it off? Here we go, slide 45. And if you can pop it in, we'll kind of see people's comfort level. And also I say, it is okay if you're not strongly, if you don't strongly agree that you're comfortable, it is absolutely okay. And owning that is what's important. So I'll give folks a few minutes and I'll like kind of read some of these chats here about sleep deprivation. The military has time and again identified sleep related to accidents here. We talk about it as a major risk. There is little change to address it if this in the service member's work life. Yeah. It is so important. And I would bring that up to your command and your local groups. I would bring up what the research says about it. There's plenty of research on military members that are affected by sleep deprivation, and a policy change around sleep, like they have with the pilots, like you have to sleep so many hours before you fly a plane, or you can't have an alcoholic drink before. It's the same type of policy change that could be in place around, our service members need to sleep for their health. Sleep is a readiness issue. But here we have a lot of people strongly agree. Oh, do we have strongly? Oh, a few people strongly disagree. I'm sorry, I read it wrong. Many agree and many strongly agree. Those that disagree in terms of your comfort level, just know that that is something that you can or should work on, or you should have someone immediately in your network. So if you interact with someone at risk, you can like get them over to someone who is more comfortable while you build up your skills in this area. And I just appreciate you for your honesty. If you neither agree nor disagree, but I always appreciate people that say, like, this is scary for me. I'm nervous doing it. I have done some teaching in graduate schools of social work, and the students will say, I'm just not sure I can do that yet. And the best way to learn how to do it is to just practice it. Like, you kind of have to like role play and practice it, which feels a little clunky at times. But I have one more here. What is the one thing you can do if someone you know is struggling with depression or anxiety? One thing that you personally could do. Depends on the person. It may not be able to help them, but I can send them to someone that can. Talk to them. Hold space. I love that. And just listen. Active listening. Staying connected to them and offering support. Yes. Oh, don't talk about yourself. Like, this is not the time to one-up them with like a story about, oh, when I was depressed back in the day. Correct. Reach out, create space, connect, be present, off your phone. You're right. Ask about suicide risk, 100%. I like that answer. Make yourself known and available, staying with them. Validate it. Yes. Being there to listen and follow up. These are all good, simple stuff in so many ways, right? I think my challenge is for all of us to teach others to do this, right? Like, I mean, likely it looks like many of you know how to do this, but like, do the other people on your base know just the difference they can make by like having a cup of coffee with someone, by like saying good morning and being a good person, being kind, being nice, being available, letting them know that you're willing to help them make an appointment, or that you know a therapist they could connect to. Ask, are they willing to contract with you? Yeah, all of these good things. So this, I think, concludes the seminar. We are going to have, I don't know if Kaylin wants me to share this or not, but I'll share this part. We are going to have another one where we're going to talk a little bit more about family members and kiddos. We're going to talk about spouses and kids, which might be some similar content, but also a whole lot more. So I appreciate everybody for chiming in. I know it's a little awkward. We're not on camera and we're going through a lot of material rather quick, but I appreciate everybody's attention to the content today, and folks participating in the chat, and the great opportunity to visit with so many of you today. Over to you, Kaylin. And you might be on mute because I don't hear anything. Coral or someone else on the team? Is there somebody else I should turn it over to?
Kaylin, could you try unmuting one more time, please?
Technology, not always our friend.
All right. It seems Kaylin is having some technical difficulties.
Yes.
But that is okay. Keita, thank you for such an incredible presentation today. We would like to invite you. Kaylin may be back with us.
Hello, can y'all hear me?
Kaylin, yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Coral, for hopping in there. And thank you all so much for engaging with us today on this very, very important topic. And we do have a few minutes. So if you have any last minute questions for Dr. Franklin while we have her here. And yes, I will be covering a little bit more about her second session that you can all join us for in April if you're interested in joining that. So we did want to highlight a few other webinars that we already do have if you are interested in just getting some more professional development around suicide prevention and that support for military families. We had these two webinars, suicide prevention and working with military families, as well as the next slide, which highlights our suicide prevention and intimate partner violence. So really conversations around how those things intersect, and how to best support families. A bit of, as Dr. Franklin mentioned today in her presentation, when we see that IPV as risk factors. So we do have those sessions that you can go ahead and watch now and get CEs for if you're interested, again, in getting some more programming around this topic as you continue to get comfortable with these conversations. We also have a podcast episode you can listen to that really talks about the application of different projects on base to help families as well around suicide prevention. And then, of course, I know we had some folks mentioning not being able to access some of the links. So yes, my colleague Jason Jowers just posted that in the chat pod. If you're having any issues getting links from the Zoom platform, please visit the webinar event page. Under event materials, you will see the PDF handout of today's slides with all of the great information that Dr. Franklin has provided, as well as a list of the event materials that have been linked throughout today's session. And if you would like to visit any of those links, again, that is also available for download. And I will be covering CE credits here in a moment. Yes, so today we have continuing education credits for from the Patient Advocate Certification Board for board certified patient advocates, from the Commission for Case Manager Certification for case managers, from the National Council on Family Relations for CFLEs, from the American Association for Family and Consumer Sciences for certified in family and consumer sciences professionals. And this is our first webinar offering CE credits from the National Advocate Credentialing Program for domestic abuse victim advocates, and as well of course, University of Texas at Austin, Steve Hicks School of Social Work for our social workers, LPCs, and LMFTs. Also, certificates of attendance will be available for anyone else wanting to document their professional development activities. So the link to the evaluation is on the event page. When you visit the page, you will see a purple button like the one on the screen. Simply click that and it will take you to the evaluation and then the post test. If you do not see this button, please refresh your page or exit out and reload, especially if you've had the page opened since the beginning of the session. And then you will be taken to the evaluation. Some certificates do require you complete a post test. Once you have completed that post test with a score of 80% or higher, certificates will be emailed to you within 24 to 48 hours of completing the process. Some email providers do direct that certificate to your spam folder, especially if this is your first time joining us for a OneOp session. If you have not received your certificate within a day or so, please email us at the email listed on the slides, ce@oneop.org, and we will make sure that you get your certificate. Dr. Franklin, we do have a few more moments, so it does look like we had a question come through. One of our attendees asked, can we talk more about the alternatives to the ER? Can we tell more about how to get buy-in from commands on acknowledging ideations versus discounting them? And they say that they specifically get a lot of feedback that because there was no diagnosis of suicide ideation, there is not suicide ideation in their experience.
Right. This is also such a good question. And the first part of it in terms of alternatives to the ER. When this is difficult, right? Because this is like the military way, like they come in, they're struggling, get them to the ER. So first I would like think about educating people on the data behind the ER. So like if we through OneOp or others, if we can give you those stats so that you are equipped with the fact that when people go to the ER, it increases their risk. That is like a moment of education. So that's one thing. And I would share that not only with your ER staff, but with like your community. And I would think about if the ER is open to like a conversation or a training on that, so that they know, so that maybe they can buffer, like, is there a quiet area where the service member can sit? Is there a fast track when they come in? If I'm at a base that has an ER, is there a fast track that they come in, they can get treated quick and in and out? And like let's kind of map out the process that would, like, in light of the fact that we have to use it, that would make it less difficult. And then also, is there something at my base where I could talk to the mental health team and say, like, look, there's this data that says that when people go to the ER, it amps them up and increases their risk for suicide, which is opposite of what we're trying to do. So during the hours that you're open, mental health shop, is there a way through my good relationship with you, because, you know, you try to have these good relationships with the other providers in your base, where I can like come directly to the mental health shop instead of the ER? Is there a way, like, are there creative pathways that we can develop locally to get people to care in a less intrusive way? And the fear, right, is like that they have to go to the ER because then they might need to be admitted. So many times these people end up going to the ER and they get some care and they get a psych consult, but they're not admitted anyway. I would pull the thread on the data on that argument, but like, think outside the box in terms of like creative pathways for getting people care that either buffers the ER's harshness, for lack of a better, or gets it in the context of you being allowed with all rules and processes on base that we have to respect, I know, or buffers them to another pathway, like that you could end up developing like a best practice or something like that. So those are a few ideas. And then the command buy-in, also like such a good question, because you have some commanders that are like so bought in that you don't even have to talk to them and they're like, I get it. And then you have others that are like, I'm not all the way buying this stuff. My best advice on that is just continuing to work to be a strong subject matter expert. When you know your content, whether it's child abuse or domestic violence, and you can crawl all over your data and you know the best practices and you can rattle them off on the top of your head, you are a true SME. They are going to buy in. Where I think we've struggled over the years, sometimes we have people in our field that aren't as confident and maybe they're new to the field and kind of God bless them. But like when you get in front of the command, just like be ready to show your expertise. Like our work in human behavior is a social science and you guys are experts in this field. So just be ready to rattle it off and give them that strong numbers and data so that you can get the buy-in and they know what an expert you are. And in terms of discounting SI, because it's not a diagnosis, we are not here to chase diagnoses. We are here to keep people safe and healthy. I should have mentioned in my brief that half of those that end their life by suicide don't have a known mental health problem. So if at our base, we only chased those that had depression and anxiety, we would miss half the problem with financial, legal, and life problems. So chasing diagnosable things alone will not bring our rates down fully. And many times in the fatality reviews, I see that people were longstanding mental health clients and ended their life by suicide. So we can't think about this in the context of chasing just diagnosable things. They have to think about it as a readiness issue, as a health and wellness issue, health of the force. And I think that will come when you like pound the pavement and explain to them just what a strong human behavior SME you are in your field. Hopefully that's helpful. I see one too. Oh no, this is about your certificate, which I am not a SME on that. So I will stand that. You mentioned chaplains a few times. Peer-reviewed scientific data shows that spirituality reduces suicidality. 100%. I should have had that on my slide. This is why you guys are so good. One of the biggest, like, remember I was talking about protective or buffers, is sense of spirituality. It gets tricky when you're briefing that out or teaching people about that because they think you mean going to church. While that is helpful because they have a community and a belief in a higher power and a common basis with people. But for other people, it is being out in nature. Like, gosh, I feel very spiritual when I wake up early before the kids and have a cup of tea. It is quiet time and it feels like quite spiritual for me. But like, you have to kind of help them understand the difference between religiosity and spirituality, and then help them understand that it is unique to the situation. The one troublesome with this is some people have a big belief, almost in a spiritual sense, with the military, and like the commandant or the, like the army is their North Star. And then when they get kind of in conflict with that, it can be a struggle. But more times than not, assessing spirituality and religiosity and having conversations about that helps you understand if that's a protective factor or not. So that was a good point that someone brought up. Okay, some CSBs have crisis intervention sites where they can do assessments and do the intake for inpatient and transport them. Yes, I've been hearing more about these, you guys. They contract with health providers to do the medical workup there as well. It's a room with a nice couch, a TV, access to music, some light and snacks. It's like being in a waiting room. It would be nice if the military implemented that. That is a very good point. Like, that's what I'm talking about when I say like out of the box. How do we think creatively on this base if we know that cold waiting rooms with like noise and kind of the environment of an ear, if we know it amps people up, like what can we do? And that is a good example. And I've seen that briefed out a number of times at conferences as well. And they're getting really good, strong data at these CSBs. And that is pushed out from SAMHSA, which is a federal agency. So it's safe to sort of share those best practices. You know, they're solid, in other words.
Thank you so much,
Yep.
Dr. Franklin. And thank you all so much for sharing your experiences and really bringing that to this conversation as well with us today with Dr. Franklin. So I know one of the folks mentioned earlier on in the session about good financial health equating to really good mental health and really translating to that. So we invite you all to join us for our webinar on March the 27th, the next week, Mind and Money, Connecting Mental Health and Financial Wellbeing. Where we will be continuing that conversation on personal and family financial well-being and the intersection between financial well-being and mental well-being. And then a lot of you were asking, Dr. Keita Franklin will be joining us for our second webinar with her on April 4th. So you can RSVP for that now. And like she mentioned, that will be around public health approaches to suicide prevention, focusing on working with military spouses and families of military connected folks. So we invite you to RSVP for that session, and we are very excited to have Dr. Keita back and bringing that expertise from all her years in the field. So if you would like to follow us on social media, that is really the best way to stay connected with us. You can also subscribe to our mailing list and make sure you get updated on upcoming webinars as well as other CE opportunities from OneOp. And again, if you enjoyed this webinar, please be sure to check out OneOp's other programming. You can visit our oneop.org website for that. And if you have any questions or concerns, please make sure to email us with the emails provided on the slides, and our OneOp team will be happy to make sure that you get those CE certificates or anything else you may need assistance with from our team. So thank you so much, and we do hope to see you again in an upcoming webinar, and hopefully you can join us for our next session with Dr. Franklin on April 4th. Thank you all so much. We'll be closing the room in a moment and appreciate all of your input and engagement today and sharing your experiences. Thank you all.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.